What's going on, everybody? It's Joe from the Acceptable Casualties, and today we're going to be doing a video on building a gladiator for Sons of Mars. The video that we're going to be doing today is going to kind of be like the general basic building a gladiator video. We'll be going into doing the specific classes of gladiators a little bit down the road, but as of right now, it's just kind of just a general build for you guys to kind of just dive in there and mess with the mechanics of the game and figure out how to build a gladiator, whether it's for competitive play or for campaign play. So let's just dive in right now. So for building a gladiator, you're going to find this section starts off on page 17 inside the rulebook or the PDF, whichever one that you're using. So going right into it right here, it kind of just explains the basics of building a gladiator, and over down here it goes over the 10 core stats that you're going to have for every gladiator that goes into the arena. So over here it's strength, agility, charisma, movement, vitality, charge, sustained, counterattack, defensive, and armor. Each of these 10 stats you're going to be using in conjunction with all the actions that are available in the game, as well as some of the skills that are provided through your weapons or through your character build. It just kind of depends on what skills that you end up putting into your gladiator. So we're going to go through these first because, like I said, these form the foundation, the bedrock of your gladiator once they hit the arena. So first up is strength. You're going to use strength in a lot of actions where it has to do with either like pushing an opponent, kind of like manhandling them in the arena and throwing them around, trying to break shields, things like that where, like I said, you're going to try to impose your will on your opponent. Next up is your agility. This is going to be more used by your smaller, quicker builds, but still also by your larger gladiators as well. The agility is going to be more for disengaging, trying to slip in and out of combats, repositioning, maybe for things like parry. A lot of those things where, like I said, where speed and cunning are kind of needed to complete these actions. Next up after that is charisma. Charisma is the core stat for when you're looking to play to the crowd to maybe gain favor dice, to intimidate opponents. It also could be used on some of the tables after a fight. So this is kind of what you're looking at right now for charisma. It's not used as often as strength and agility, and it's a basic. You get no modifiers through any of the classes. This is something that you have to either buy into by giving you guys certain skills to give them a boost to charisma, or you can purchase certain equipment like maybe like helmet feathers or something that that draws the eye of the crowd and kind of plays to the crowd a little bit. So this is like, it's a base stat line of 0 for everybody. It's something that you kind of have to build into to use, but it can be very important for gameplay purposes. Next up is movement, and it's exactly what you think it would be, is your ability, how fast you move around the arena. After that is vitality. This is kind of our hit point stat. So, you have a vitality of, let's say, a 10. That's how many hits that you can take throughout the course of a match before you end up falling in combat. And when you hit 0, your gladiator doesn't die. It's just, you've just been defeated, and then what happens from that point on will be tallied up in the defeat table, and we'll get to that in other videos as well to go over that. So this is vitality. It's essentially your hit points. Next up, we're getting into the 5 stats we just went over right now. Those are kind of your attributes that everybody has, just so your attributes as a person, as a gladiator. After that is more of the combat-based stats. So that's going to be the top row down here, if you guys can see it, is going to be your attributes for like your physical, and then below that is going to be more of your combat stats. So first up is charge. This stat is going to be used for when you are charging into an opponent. You have to be within 3 inches or less, and you charge into the combat. This is your way of kind of like pressing the combat, going in, trying to land a flurry of strikes. So this is going to be your charge stat that you're going to get. Some gladiators have a higher charge stat than others. It just kind of depends on what class you're using and weapon combination to go with it. Sustained is kind of going to be your toe-to-toe combat stat, where either you already have gone through like the charge and counterattack phase and you're kind of just standing toe-to-toe and you're locked in, or you're slowly moving into a combat, not necessarily running into a combat, but kind of just like pacing yourself and moving step by step slowly. This would be your sustained combat pool. This is probably the most common combat that you're going to run into in Sons of Mars. A bulk of your combat will probably fall into sustained. But that kind of also depends on your play style as well, and we'll also be getting into that a little bit later. Next up is counterattack. Counterattack is kind of similar to defense, and we'll differentiate the two right now. So counterattack is when mostly going to be used when an opponent charges you. You're always going to use your counterattack your pool right there. It's a way for you to, you know, essentially counterattack your opponent when they're running in at you. It also can be used in sustained combat if somebody uses the move into combat action, and we'll be doing that when we go. We'll be going over that as well when we go into the action video a little bit later on. So that's kind of counterattack. It's, you know, essentially you just counterattacking your opponent as they're coming at you. Defensive stance. So this is an action as well as a stat line. So defensive stance is kind of a way for, if you're, say you're just getting beat in the arena right now, it's getting late in the rounds, and you kind of need a way to compose yourself, whether you want to get your fatigue leveled out so you're not as big of an disadvantage when you're rolling off in strength and agility tests or initiative tests. Defensive stance is kind of a good way for you to sit there and weather the storm for maybe a round or two until you're able to kind of, you know, get your physical stats back up to where you're going to be able to maybe do some more actions, as well as maybe not giving up as much damage if you're in a bad situation. So the defensive stat in here, you can only really use it when you use the defensive stance action, and that's very limited in combat. It's not a common thing, but when it is used, it can play a very, very big role as far as keeping you active and keeping you alive in the combat. So we'll also go into that later and when we go over more of the actions and some of the other builds for some of the other gladiators. After that is armor. This is going to be the last stat that we're going to go over, and this is pretty much just your save. You're going to take this stat, you're going to roll a d10 and put them together. If you reach a 10 or higher, you're able to save. So this is the armor stat that you're going to see on a lot of the profiles. Is going to be down here in the bottom right hand corner. That's just your basic your armor loadout that you wear on your body. When you purchase certain weapons for your gladiators, you're going to have the options to get a parmula, a scutum, some other things that might give you a boost to your armor. You're going to take those stats and you'll add them to your armor stat for your profile so you can get a bigger buff. Usually for the heavy gladiators, you're looking at a +3 to +4 to your dice roll for saves. For your lighter gladiators, it's ranging usually between +1 and +2, and we'll get into that when we start talking about the actual builds, and you'll see why those are set up like they are. So that's kind of the 10 stats that you're looking at for your core build right now. The next page over here, it kind of just goes over you know, the decisions you're going to make as far as the build goes, is whether you're choosing a class, your abilities that you're going to choose when you're building your gladiator, the weapons you're going to choose, and your equipment. So when you take all of these into account, just because maybe say we both pick the Secutor class, we're not going to have the same build most of the time. Most of the time, going through the classes, based on the different weapons you choose, the abilities that you bring with it, your fight styles in the arena and the way that you're going to face off against your opponents can be drastically different from someone who picks a similar class. I spoke about this in the earlier video as well as doing an overview of the rules. These classes, there's 17 classes inside the rule set, but each of those, like I said, based off the weapons and abilities that you build at the beginning, as well as, you know, that you grow into through the campaign system or in competitive play based off what ones you buy, they can play extremely differently depending on who you're fighting against and what their build is, not just necessarily the choices that you make. So there's a lot of differences through all these classes and how combat can unfold in the arena based off your decisions, but also based on the builds for your opponents as well. So that's kind of the brief overview for building a gladiator. Now we're going to go into one of the classes right here and kind of go over how the build goes. So I'm going to use the Secutor class. This is on the first set right here of the gladiators. It's going to be found on page 20. Secutor is going to be more considered a heavy build for Sons of Mars. So you're going to have heavy builds and light builds. We're going to go over Secutor right now. Probably the most forgiving class as far as gameplay goes in the book right now. You're going to have a very solid sustained combat stat, like I said, which is going to be the most common stat that you're probably going to use in combat, as well as a very forgiving armor stat as well. What they lack in is going to be their agility, their ability to counterattack, and their ability to charge into combat. They're not very strong in those areas, but they do have a good armor save. They do have a good amount of vitality. They're fairly mobile, and they're very good once they get stuck in. So we're going to go over Secutor right now as our heavy build. So if you go right here, you're going to notice that Secutor, it costs 15 coins for you to purchase him as a slave, whether you're doing it for campaign or competitive play. I guess I could just put this out there right now as well. If you're doing competitive play, we found that between 150 and 200 points for 4 gladiators is a good way to play for competitive play. It gives you enough to go out and purchase multiple gladiators, get a solid primary weapon, as well as purchase enough of abilities to where you're going to have you're going to be able to have a solid fight style in there. Or you said you could front load it and make like 2 super gladiators and then bring 2 guys that are garbage to the table. But roughly 150 to 200 points we found to be the sweet spot for competitive play as far as having a point total to build toward. For campaign play, you're going to be looking at, you're going to have 100 coins to spend when you start your campaign. So you're probably going to be able to buy whatever gladiator you want, but you're not going to be able to outfit them with the best equipment off the bat. But if you decide to do that, you're just going to have a much smaller ludus to start with. You only have maybe 2 gladiators, maybe 3, opposed to maybe 4 or 5 to start with. And that's totally up to you once campaign play starts. So that's what you're going to see up here. Secutor, he's 15 coins to purchase this class of gladiator, to train one of your slaves in this class of gladiator. The stat line for him, he's going to have his strength to start as a +1. His agility is a -1. His charisma is a 0. His movement's a 4. His vitality is a 9. So those are his physical stats right there. So you can see through Secutor, he's a little bit more on the strong build side with staying power, and you're going to find that's a constant theme going through with a lot of these heavy gladiators. Down below, you're going to see he starts off with the charge dice pool of only a 1, sustained dice pool of a 2, his counter pool is only a 1, his defense is a 1, and his armor stat is a base of a +2. You're also going to notice this theme going through as well. Since the heavier gladiators have more staying power, better armor save, better health, a little bit stronger, they tend to lack on volume of attacks because they're bigger, they're more lumbering, they're more heavily armored. They're not going to be able to get as many strikes off in a combat. Where you go to the lighter builds, and it's the direct opposite of that. They're not going to have as much health, but they're going to be a lot quicker. They're going to have a lot more volume of attacks in most situations. So it's kind of a trade-off based on what kind of class of gladiator you play with to your dice pools and some of your attribute stats. So this is going to be the 10 stat block that we went over before. That's kind of the basic loadout here for Secutor. Now, right here, no matter what Secutor that you're going to build and choices that you make, your stat block is always going to start with this framework right here. So usually when I build a gladiator, looking at this, the next thing I like to go into is what kind of weapon that I want to pick up. Now for Secutor, the weapon choices you have, they can branch off into different things. So first off, you have the Gladius with the Scutum. This is like the basic build for you to go in to really hammer home that sustained value. So with the Gladius and Scutum, you get 1 extra die for your charge, 2 extra for your sustained, and 1 for your counter, none for your defense, and you also get a +2 to your armor. Now this costs 20 coins. So right now you're already at 35 coins for this build for this gladiator. Fairly expensive to start off with in campaign play. Also for regular competitive play, it's like that as well. So with the charge, to find out what your charge dice pool is going to be, you just take your charge stat up here for your stat block, add it to the weapon. So in charge situations, you're going to only have 2 dice. But in sustained combat, you're going to add the 2 from your stat block to the 2 from the weapon. You're going to have 4 dice. This is where the Secutor is strong. Like we said earlier, you're getting stuck in. Counterattack, the same thing. He's only going to have 2 dice when you add those 2 together. This weapon build doesn't add anything to your defensive stats, so he only has 1 when he's in defensive stance. So not very good when he's on his back foot, as you can see. Like I said, you want to be more aggressive and pushing at this point. And then the armor, he gets a +2 for this build with the Scutum, plus his armor, so he has a +4 to armor saves, which means you only need to really roll a 6 for you to save against any wounds that come your way. So pretty good build right there. That's the standard build for a Secutor as far as weapons go. Now you can save a couple bucks and go with the Parmula. It's the same exact stat line, except you give up 1 armor point, so you only get a +3 for your armor when you put everything together, but you do gain parry, and parry sometimes gives you the ability, if you get a critical strike or critical success in combat, to where you can reposition your gladiator anywhere in base combat with your opponent. So if you have your back up against a wall, your back up against a spiked pit, or anything like that when you're in a bad situation, if you get the parry opportunity, you can literally pull a 180 and scoot around to the other side of your opponent if you pass some of your attribute tests, and that goes off for you. So it's handy. You just sacrifice a little bit of armor for a little bit more mobility in the arena. So those are the 2 builds that you can put together with your weapons for sustained. The other weapon option they have is called a Spatha with the Scutum. Now the Spatha, instead of you getting 2 sustained and 1 charge, it flips. You get 2 charged and you get 1 sustained with the Spatha for the Secutor. So you're still going to get the +2 armor save. Your counterattack's still going to be a 2, but instead of you having 2 charge and 4 sustained, you're now looking at a 3/3. So it's a little more balanced build. You're not as specialized inside with their strength, which is sustained, but you have a little more flexibility as far as opportunities that might have come in the arena, where you might look to have you might have an opportunity to get like a good charge off against an opponent, and you have some extra favor dice. Now you're starting with 3 dice in your dice pool instead of 2, so it's kind of just based off of how you want to build it. This one also costs 20. So the Gladius with Scudum and Spatha with Scudum, they both cost the same. It's just the choice that you want to make as far as how you want your build to go. Do you want to be a strong, sustained build that's really about getting stuck in, or do you want to balance things out a little bit more and have a good opportunity to get some quality charges off, as well as to be able to hold yourself in sustained? So as you can see, the weapon choices that you have for your primary weapons, they can affect on how your build's going to go once you start factoring abilities and things like that as well. So now that you've kind of we've chosen our weapon, we'll start with the Gladius and Scudum because it's more of the traditional build for Secutor. So we're going to go into the abilities now. So the abilities here, it's always good to look at these as how you can really complement your vision for your Gladiator, your fight style, the weapons you choose, and kind of just build on that. Not necessarily going and just cherry pick the best skills. Sometimes it's better to look at how they all work together. So for your Secutor, the 5-point abilities, when you build a Gladiator in campaign, you automatically get one of these. When you're doing competitive play, it just goes, and you just have to purchase a skill. So you know, based off the build we have for competitive play, you're already looking at 35 points. Now you can go through, well, it's 35 coin, that translates into points. It's the same currency when you put them together. So for your abilities, you have 5-point abilities, 10-point abilities, and 15-point abilities. Usually for most of the classes, you have 4 choices in all of these. You go through, and then for competitive play, you just kind of cherry pick the ones that you want. You pay the points cost for them, and that factors into how much your Gladiator is going to cost. For campaign play, you just get to start with one of the 5-point abilities to kind of give your Gladiator a little bit more flavor, and then as you gain experience points and as the campaign progresses, you'll be able to purchase more abilities, whether it's 5, 10, or 15. They're not locked off or in a tree. You literally can pick whatever one you want as long as you have the skill points to put toward it. So for the build that we have, like I said, we're going to go with the sustained build with the Gladius and the Scudum. Some of the best options right here, because you're going to be stuck in for 5 points. Usually we see people go with Shield Bash. Shield Bash lets you use the push action, and then it lets you re-roll it, and the push action is built off of your strength. So you're going to go into most situations, you're going to have a +1 to your strength roll, and then the Shield Bash stat, as long as you have your shield still with you and you're not disarmed, you're able to re-roll that roll. So it gives you a really good opportunity to kind of push around your opponent, maybe get their backs against the walls, push them into pillars, and then kind of like hopefully you can knock them down prone, and then you can kind of just get stuck in with them and just start landing a flurry of blows up close, which is the strength of the Secutor. That's usually a really good one to pick up off the bat. So if you pick up Shield Bash, we'll say in the 5-point abilities, you know, it might not be a bad idea to combine some of these other stats with it. Now, you can go with Stout, which only lets your opponent push you back 1 inch instead of 2 inch when they use the push action. It's not a bad way to go, but if you're willing to save up, you can get into other stats up here, which is Strength +1, which is kind of nice to combine with Shield Bash. It gives you obviously a better chance to push your opponents around in the arena, as well as doing some of the other things as far as improving your death blow. If you get an opportunity to kill an opponent with 1 hit, you go from a +1 to a +2, so you only need an 8 up to kill an opponent in those situations opposed to a 9. So that's something to look at. Impenetrable as well for this 10-point ability. That lets you reroll an armor save during the course of a match. It may not sound like much, but just having 1 reroll, chance to do a 6-up reroll, especially if somebody lands a critical strike on you, just having this one in there without having to burn any favor dice, it's a solid ability to have that does pay off more often than not. So you have this one in there for your 10-point abilities. Another big one in here, if you go into 15-point, you can start building on your charge and sustain. You can buy a +1 for your extra charge attack. So if you want to maybe do a sustained build, but then also boost your charge up so you balance up a little bit later, you can do that for 15 points. It's expensive, but for the long run, it might be worth doing. Or you can go all in for our Gladiator and say, we want to buy another sustained die. So his pool going from now 4 to 5 is another thing to look at. So there's things in here that you can really complement your builds. And like I said, this is just for the sustain build. If you go with the charge build, there's other stats to look at. So in here, you can use knockdown. So when you get into combat, you're able to knock down your opponent with some critical strikes as far as strength tests and things go. That's only 5 points. That's really good to have if you have a charge. Another thing as well to look at too is stagger. So stagger, if you charge into your opponent and you end up hitting your opponent with a critical strike on a charge, you're going to also, after you do all the damage, you're going to be able to push them back as well for 2 steps, for 2 inches, and with the potential of possibly pushing them back for 3. So you can really manhandle your opponent with the stagger ability as well. But it really works better if you're building on a charge build, which would lend itself more to using the Spatha and Scutum. So as you guys can see, the list of abilities that you have throughout for the Gladiator builds in here, they really play towards some of the strengths and some of the strengths on the weapons that you choose as well as the build that you choose. It's not just going through and just being like, hey, I want to take shield dash, stagger, and charge +1. They might not all complement the build and fight style that you're looking for. So it's always best, especially in campaign play, to really try to look at what you want to purchase now and what you're gonna be able to purchase in the future to kind of build these, build your gladiators so they're optimal when you put them on the sands and they get into combat, so they can really do all the things that you want to do. So this is kind of the Secutor build right now. And we're gonna go down now. So this is kind of how it works out for a heavy build. I'll also show you guys a light gladiator build, and we'll go into that as well. So let's see, who would be a good one to pull up in here? We'll do Democarius. This is a fun build. So Democarius is also 15 coins to start, like we talked to. His strength is a 0, agility +1, charisma 0. He has a 5 movement, vitality 8. So as you can see, a lot more mobile, but it has a little less staying power as far as vitality goes. For his dice pools, he starts off with the charge 2 dice, sustained to 2 dice, counter of 1, defense 1, and his armor's a +2. So his base stats, as you can see, they're pretty solid. You get a really good amount of dice for your base stats for your dice pool, as well as you start off with a +2 for armor. But Democarius, you don't have an option to get any extra armor. The +2, there's no option for him with the sword. He uses 2 blades, so the +2 is as good as it's going to get for him. For his weapons down here, you have the Sika, which is kind of a long hook sword that you can purchase. It's 20 for that cost, but it gives you 3 extra dice on the charge, which would give you a 5 pool for your charge dice. 1 for your sustained, which would give you 3 dice for your sustained when you add the stat block to the weapon together. 2 for your counter, no for defense, no for armor. But you also get Shield Breaker. So Shield Breaker, if you charge an opponent and you get a critical success, you can opt to do less damage, but you can take a shot at possibly breaking their shield. This is a great thing to use if, say, you have Democarius facing off against Secutor, where he has like that heavy armor plus the shield on top of it. Early in the fight, you break that shield, you've now leveled the playing field, actually probably giving yourself more of an advantage. You've taken their armor advantage away, and now you have more attacks than probably what they're going to be able to defend with in most cases, which is going to kind of favor you in the fight. Whereas if later in the fight, it might be better just to go for the wounds and not try to break the shield. And these are all strategy and tactics that we'll go into later as well when we start going through some of these classes. So that's the 2 Seek you can get there. It's 20 for that. So if you just do that off the bat, it's 35 coin to purchase that build right off the bat before we get into stats. Also, you can go with Gladius. 2 Gladius. So 2 Gladius, it's almost the same thing as the Sika, except you're going to be doing, you're only going to get 1 added dice pool to your charge. So you only have 3 for your charge, but you're going to get 5 for your sustain. So this build for Democarius, you're still going to be able to charge, but you won't be as effective. But when you get stuck in, you're going to be able to hold your own. You're going to have 5 attacks locked in. You probably don't want to stay locked in combat against most heavy gladiators just because you're not going to have the armor save advantage. But you will have volume of dice, and you'll see the value of that when we do the combat video next, which is going to be coming up. So you're going to see how all this kind of plays together. So the being locked toe-to-toe with this build of Democarius is not necessarily a bad thing as a light gladiator because you're throwing a heavy volume of dice in those situations. But the downside is you lose Shield Breaker because Gladius does not have that, but it is a little bit cheaper as far as cost goes to purchase the 2 Gladius. So those are the 2 weapon choices you have. One leans itself more heavily toward a charge build, one toward a sustained build. And like I said, that's a constant theme that you're going to see going throughout all the Gladiator classes. You're going to have different weapon combinations that are going to strengthen a lot of your combat stats. Just depends on what you choose. Now down here for their stat line, for 5-point abilities, you have dodge, frenzy, stagger, and movement +1. So a lot of these, 2 of these play toward the charge, which is going to be frenzy and stagger. The stagger we went over, it gives you the ability to get a push off as well as you doing a combat, which is great for 5 points because it lets you really set the tempo early on in a match if you're able to where you can back up somebody into some terrain pieces, possibly knock them over, do some other things with them. So stagger is very good for the D. Macarius build. And then you get into frenzy as well. Frenzy gives you an extra die on one of your charges in the fight. So if you end up winning the initiative first round, you can go in there and you can add an extra die to your charge right off the bat. So you could possibly be throwing 6 dice in the first combat of the fight. And then if you're fighting against somebody like Secutor, well, they only have 2 dice to counterattack, so it's 6 dice against 2, which is a very big advantage in Sons of Mars. And, you know, like so once we go over the combat, you guys will see how much that plays out. There's also things in here like dodge and move +1, which kind of play more toward positioning and getting your guys set up to launch attacks in there. So that's what you're looking at for his abilities. Once you get into the 10-point abilities, you're looking at sure footing, which makes it harder for him to kind of get knocked down and knocked prone, especially if you're a lighter gladiator or somebody who really relies on getting in and out of combat and being very mobile. You don't want to be prone and on your back. That's a bad situation for these guys. They just don't have the staying power to be able to really deal with that for a round or 2 of combat. If the dice don't go their way, it can be really devastating in a fight. Endurance is another good one for these guys because endurance lets you reroll fatigue tests. So it's going to keep you in a place where you're going to have that agility advantage in most cases, and as your opponent gets more tired, you know, that agility advantage, you know, you might have a +1, your opponent might have a -1 for agility. They might get more tired and they might have to take a penalty for that, which might be like, you know, another -1 on top of it. So you might have like a +3 advantage. If they have like a -2, you have a +1 for any initiative test or agility scores or anything like that. You have a +3 advantage for those tests. So it really makes it better for you to kind of dip out of combat and then charge back in and use your charge attack. Or maybe you want to disengage and maybe play to the crowd to get some favor dice. Endurance does a really good job of you not really feeling the effects of the fatigue as the match goes on, where your opponent might have to deal with it more, and it's going to open up a lot more strategic options on the table for you. And that really plays well into the builds where you're trying to use strength and agility for a lot of your skills and your weapons abilities. It's a great stat to have. Aggressive is another good one. Say your opponent charges into you and you're D. Macarius. Your counterattack is never going to be good as D. Macarius. You're never going to be fighting on your back foot. That's not the situation that you want to be in. Aggressive lets you, once per fight, if somebody charges you, you can charge right back at them. So they can use their charge stat, you can use your charge stat. So if you keep that one in your back pocket through the length of the match, and maybe your opponent has a decent charge build and they'll have an advantage if they use it, as long as you keep that in your back pocket, it's going to make them think twice about coming at you, because they're going to get hit with a flurry of blows worse than they're going to give it in at least one combat a game. So, like I said, a lot of these abilities, they play to the strengths and strategies for these classes, and it just really comes down to the choices that you want to make as a player. Like I said, not everyone's going to play the same. Not everybody's going to build their gladiator the same. So you might go in there and you might face a D. Macarius who might have that classical charge build. But at the same time, you might face somebody else who is maybe going for something a little more balanced and a little more sustained combat based. So, you know, you go in there, you might have an idea what you want to do against your opponent, but it might not be the same build that you faced last time. The build that they have might not mirror the strengths and weaknesses that you have for whatever class that you're using. So the strategies, tactics, and gladiator builds, they make for a very different experience once the fighting starts and every time you play. So I really enjoyed that as far as how that played out in the rule set, as well as when we went through playtesting and just watching people roll the dice. It's not the same fights every time when you get the gladiators in there, whether, you know, what class that you're facing off against. It really comes down to the players and the strategies and the builds that they want to use and how they match up against each other. And it really makes for a great experience out there. It turns into more of a thinking man's game than a dice rolling game. So this is kind of the basics for building your Gladiator and getting them out there. The best advice I can leave you guys in closing is, when you're doing it from just a general standpoint, is take the time to look at the Gladiators, go through, match them up with the kind of player that you are. If you're an aggressive player, like Demacarius is perfect. Like he'll work out really well for it. If you're more about getting stuck in and just throwing dice, like Secutor is great. If you're looking to be more on, your back foot, playing the counterattack game or the defensive game, Rotarius is really good. You can do it with the Hoplite, the Hoplomachus. Like there's a lot of good builds for that as well. Play to your strength, play to the Gladiator strengths, play to your strategic strengths, and use that. And I think if you take that kind of build and you put it out there on the tabletop, you'll have a lot of fun and you'll be a lot more effective. And then also too, go in there and just play around and mix some stuff up. It might open up some doors. Like I said, I've been playing this now for over a year, and I'm still learning some of these different builds and different combinations with these Gladiators by just playing around and mixing it up. There's tons of options and tons of ways to get into each of these classes and really build something that fits a certain theme or a certain style of play that you might be looking for. So I hope this kind of helped you guys out with building a Gladiator, the basics of it. And like I said, we'll be coming back later, going over doing a strategic and tactics video for each of these classes as far as builds and combat. And the next video we'll be having coming up will be the combat video, so you guys can actually see how the combat system works, and we'll do a little bit dice rolling as well, so you can kind of see it in action. So thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys later. And like I said, if you have any questions or anything, just feel free to contact us over on theacceptablecasualties.com. There's an option there to do it, or you can go to our Facebook page and I can get back to you even quicker that way. So thanks for watching.